debut album from Frank Carter and the Rattlesnakes. It was called Blossom, and it was... Kerrang said it best, where it wasn't a comeback, it was a revival for Frank. And so I'll do a bit of backstory to how we got to Blossom. So obviously, Frank made his name in the punk rock band Gallows, a band that I love. Just they might be my favorite band of all time. They're certainly up there. It's a big question to ask anyone, but they remain one of my favorite bands of all time. And Frank left on the back of Great Britain, which to me, and especially this century, Great Britain is definitely one of the greatest hardcore bands, albums, sorry, this millennia has seen. I'd go far as to say it transcends that like hardcore, like take out the hardcore bubble, it will still be up there, one of the greatest albums released this generation. It was I don't want to go into it too much because this is a review of Blossom, but it was just a triumph of what you could do with hardcore and what you could do with punk rock. Frank left after Great Britain. He also left after Gallows left a £1 million contract with Warner Brothers. And there is a great article on The Guardian, written by a man called Ben Myers, called Gallows' Great Rock and Roll Swindle. Definitely recommend you go read that because he puts into a lot more words, a lot better words than I ever could. But basically, Warner Brothers thought they could snag the next edgy punk band that they could potentially cash in on. So along the lines of Green Day or My Chemical Romance or that kind of thing. Gallows then took that money, instead of quote unquote selling out or whatever, they used that money to make one of the sickest and darkest albums of modern times, and just pumped that into making such a at times terrifying soundscape. Like they found a sample online of a pig slaughterhouse and put that in the album to create more of a theme behind it. It is just insane what they did with the money. And they subsequently got dropped by Warner Brothers because Warner Brothers didn't like the fact they couldn't really market it as a radio-friendly album. You can kind of see why. And yeah, when Frank left in 2011, I think the day after he announced he was leaving Gallows played Sonosphere, what ended up being their last festival show as a band. And during this performance, Frank wore a shirt that said Pure Love, which ended up being his new band. Already caused like a bit of a rift between him and his bandmates, because you are basically advertising what comes next when the guys you're leaving behind are still not quite sure what they're doing yet. So, weird move on Frank's part, but nonetheless, he formed Pure Love with the former guitarist of the Hoax Conspiracy, a gentleman called Jim Carroll. And as I was saying before, when it was like during the Swarm of the Sun review, Pure Love had a much more summer hard rock kind of sound. And the first song that debuted was a song called Bury My Bones. And it opens with the line, "I'm so sick of singing about hate, it's never going to make a change," which again was rubbing a lot of people up the wrong way, because it's kind of like a slap in the face of his previous work. Like, as much as I will sing the praises of Great Britain, Orchestra of Rules, which was their Gallows debut album, is still a fucking phenomenal record. And they got a lot of praise in terms of the musical output, the live show, and opening with that line for a new project did seem like he was just saying, "Ah, fuck it, I don't need it anymore." Nonetheless, though, they released Anthems a couple of years later in 2013, and they followed up with The Bunny, which was a three-track EP in 2014, before splitting up that year. They basically split up and released that all in one go, saying this is the last 3 songs we ever recorded. Have at, and we're about to go on a leaving tour, which was, as I said before about Pop, was the very first show I ever went to. I'm a late bloomer to the live music scene, I'll happily admit. In terms of an album, I know with people knowing Frank from Gallows, I think it's hard to separate what you know someone for compared to what they're doing now. Like I've just listened to a review for the Fever 333 album, and in it they say it took them a long time to remember that this isn't the Jason Allen Butler from Let Live anymore. This is now the Jason Allen Butler from Fever 333. And I think a lot of people at the time had a similar sort of deal with Frank at the time, and they had to separate the fact that this was not. Even I had to do it, especially I was not a fan of the Bury My Bones song at first. But there comes a time where I needed to realise that this wasn't the Frank that I knew from Gallows, this was the Frank I knew from Pure Love now. And once you get past that, I quite enjoyed it. After, like I said, Bury My Bones, quite a cheesy album. It then became a case of, like, Handsome Devil's Club is a really, really, just like a fun song. I remember, all I've got in my head now is just the music video for it. And it's just bathed in sunshine, and as dumb as that sounds, it is, like I said, it's a very summery record. And so I really, really enjoyed it. Just trying to think of the songs from the album now. Handsome Devil's Club, Beat Your Dharma is like a slow, bluesy kind of song. Riot Song should have had like a much more of a following behind it. I think I would love to have seen that song live as well. But c'est la vie. I can't actually remember what they played when they played Lincoln. Oh well. But yeah, either way, Anthems came out, and it was a chance for Frank to branch out and sort of like experiment with himself musically. Like he'd been slapped with this like one-dimensional reputation with Gallows, which I think is untrue. Going back, although it was quite sparse, look at a song like The Vultures Act 1 and 2 from Great Britain, and you could hear him sing more than scream. Although, like I said, it's a very minimal example of this, it did show that he was capable of expanding out a little bit more. And all those ideas he could then put into, he had then put into Anthems. Either way, for whatever reason, Pure Love didn't last, and I think officially they are on hiatus, so in theory they could all come back. I don't see it, but stranger things have happened. And then within a year, there had been teasers from Frank about what he was doing next musically. He had a little bit of a break, which I was very, very nervous about, because I was like, Frank, what are you doing? But he eventually came back. He eventually was teasing a lot, and it eventually became Frank Carter and the Rattlesnakes. Initially billed as a solo project, because the name. It featured, obviously, our dear Frank, formerly of Gallows and Pure Love. It featured Dean Richardson from the Outgoing Heights, Membi Jago from The Ghost of a Thousand, and Thomas Mitchener from Spycatcher. So there's a lot, apart from Spycatcher, there's a lot of hardcore and punk backing behind this new project. And from memory, I think with the new band, very short time afterwards, they released a debut EP, which was Rotten. And all three songs ended up becoming part of what became Blossom. It was Fangs, Paradise, and Primary Explosive. And it was an absolute, like I was saying with the Kerrang review before, it wasn't a comeback, it was a revival. Because it was return of the more guttural punk that made Frank a known name. It straddles that line between hardcore and punk rock so finely, to the point where I see a lot of people describe it as a punk rock album with hardcore influences, which is a weird thing to read and to hear. But once you go into it a little bit more, you can kind of see why. Fangs, which was like the first song, it rips just like Orchestra of Wolves did back in the day. It was a lot more of a straightforward punk song. And overall, it was just quite bleak and cynical, especially with Paradise, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. Excuse me, still dying again. Excuse me. So yeah, we had Rotten. Eventually, it became the full album of Blossom, and Blossom opened with this huge, I can only describe it as like a massive groove metal-esque riff in Juggernaut, and it was such a return to form in terms of just bitterness and anger. It's such an angry song where, like, the screams he does, particularly before the breakdown, you think that he might be about to do himself an injury. Excuse me, like that. And it's the first of like many confrontational songs on the album. So you got Juggernaut, and it repeats the line, "Even on my own, you can't stop me," which was, if I'm so sick of singing about hate, he's never going to make a change, was the message or like the ethos he had going into Pure Love. Even on my own, you can't stop me is definitely the ethos he had coming into Rattlesnakes. I'm quite interested now to go back to the opening song of Abandoned Ship on Orchestra Walls. Wasn't quite the same message back then, but for the looks of his new project, it's always been a case of opening line, it's a statement of intent, so to speak. So yeah, you had that in Juggernaut. Paradise was an attack on suicide bombers and just challenging their beliefs and the ideals in general. Album closer, I Hate You, is a full, like, dick swinging, skulking. I don't want to call it a ballad, but it kind of is, maybe like a bluesy sort of thing. I'm not quite sure. And it's just listening all the way. You can say you don't like someone, and I am all for that. Any chance to tell someone they're like, I don't like them, but in just creative and fun ways, I'm always going to be a part of that. You end up getting into Loss, which is where it becomes much more of a personal record. It's a very bleak song where Frank essentially lists all the things he's lost, including he's got everything from his mind, his senses, his friends, his family, his wife, the life he built as a musician. And if you follow him on social media, you'll see that he wears a lot of his emotions on his sleeve and then posts about it because he feels, I don't know, I think it's a case of he wants to put him a case of he doesn't want to be seen as this bulletproof guy because he's got a daughter now. He wants her to know, I guess, that's okay to have emotions and blah, 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 blah. I don't want to speculate too much because as far as I'm aware, he hasn't outright said why he's quite personal on social media, but following things like his Instagram, it is very, very personal, and Loss is like the musical interpretation of all that. You move on to a song like Beautiful Death, and it is like the first of a double header about death. So Beautiful Death is more about it's the perspective of someone left on the surface when someone dies. And it's kind of like the first indication of what would come after Blossom, because it's quite a slow, bluesy song, little bits of touches of shoegaze, but in terms of lyrically, yeah, it's all about you've lost someone and you just give that, you could anything to have that last 10 minutes just to say what you really thought of them, kind of deal. And then the other side of it, the next song afterwards, called Rotten Blossom, is from the perspective, I guess, of the corpse, where they question the afterlife, like what actually happens to us, and it goes through various different ideas from various different religions, just general thoughts and processes more about the people, just challenging for both sides in those two songs. Overall, Blossom is a very raw, very visceral, and very emotional album. I think, despite the fact it's called Frank Carter and the Rattlesnakes, I think this is the first album where you can say, or I think the only album I should say, sorry, where this is a solo album for Frank. Because I think this was a chance to get everything off his chest, especially, particularly lyrically. And what's important to know is it wasn't just paint by numbers hardcore. There's a lot more. It's a lot more riff driven. Songs like Beautiful Death, where it's got the seeds of what would become Modern Ruin and what sounds like End of Suffering. And I honestly think it's to do with the so far very underrated partnership between Frank Carter and Dean Richardson, formerly of Heights. Frank has said in a lot of social media postings about their relationship and their partnership and the songwriting partnership, and in a lot of promo coming up, that's been released for the upcoming album, it's no longer just Frank on its own, it's Frank and Dean, which I think is really, really interesting. So I'm looking forward to End of Suffering, because obviously, and then whatever comes next to find out where that partnership goes to, that a possible new punk power couple between Frank and Dean. So what happened afterwards? So the partnership with Dean, like I said, it kind of moved on into Modern Ruin, where although a lot of the, well, I'd say a lot, damn near all of the very visceral punk stuff had been taken away in Modern Ruin, there was so much more creatively going on. So you had a lot of indie stuff in there, a lot of alt rock in there, a few dabbles in gothic rock as well, and by the sounds of Crowbar, that's kind of what's going to go into End of Suffering as well. But for Blossom, it was almost written as if Frank had, like I said, when I said Frank on Rattlesnakes, Blossom was his only one we could say it was a solo album. It was more written with a point to prove. Like with Pure Love, I remember seeing, even now people will still see it as a more like sellout kind of album, which personally I don't subscribe to. I know I've got various different conflicting opinions about that, but I think the fact that Frank stepping away from one of the fastest growing hardcore acts in the country to then releasing a very more accessible hard rock album, so then going back to something like this, which like is up there with the Gallows output that Frank had released in terms of just like aggression and heaviness. I think it's more a testament to Frank than anything else, the fact that he can go from A to B back to A again and make A sound so fucking good still. And yeah, I don't think Frank will. There's always like someone asking if Frank's gonna go back to Gallows or Frank's gonna be punk as fuck again. I think as a person, Frank is always gonna be punk as fuck. You can't be a man like that and not be. As much as Modern Ruin is different and the like potential End of Suffering has to be as well, I don't ever see Frank going back to making this kind of music again. At least not anytime soon. I certainly don't see him going back to Gallows. Wade has definitely grown to me in terms of a vocalist for Gallows, but aside from a potential like live appearance from like either Frank going to Gallows or someone from Gallows going into Rattlesnakes for a bit, but as like a live treat maybe at a festival, but in terms of Frank going back to Gallows or Frank being out and out hardcore again, I don't see it happening. I think as much as he is trying to manage his personal life as well, I think he is happy with this new sound he's cultivated, his new expansive punk rock. I still think Modern Ruin is a punk rock album. It's just got a lot more going on than Blossom and Great Britain and Orchestra. But yeah, that's in terms of living in the moment. I think Blossom remains one of my definitely a favorite album for me. And going back and listening to it and making the comparisons to Gallows, to Pure Love, to this, it is really cool to see the fact that he heard all this shit, came back, fucking exploded with this, and then went back to doing arguably what he's more wanted to do now. I know there's rumors and everything about his voice failed in him during the recordings of Modern Ruin, but End of Suffering is going in the same way by the looks of it. So I think this is the Frank we have now, and that's okay. If you never went in on Blossom, and this has been a very wish-washy, all over the place review, but someone knocked on my door and it really threw me off, and I'm very, very sad. If you never went in on Frank Card and Rattlesnakes Blossom, and comparisons I could give it, if you really enjoy the debut Gallows album, Orchestra of Wolves, that quite, I don't want to say low budget, because that makes it sound shit, but more raw sounding punk, I think you'd really go for this. If you really enjoyed the Turnstile album from last year, I think you should. If you listen to Turnstile and you haven't listened to Blossom, I'll be very impressed. But I still think you should go back and give it a go if you haven't already listened to it already on the back of Time and Space. And I think for a third one, I'll go with Comeback Kid, the Canadian hardcore band. So yeah, if you dug Orchestra of Wolves, if you dug Turnstile, or Comeback Kid, I think you'll go for Frank Carter and the Rattlesnakes debut album, Blossom. And that